Officially live. Welcome.
Woo-hoo.
Yay!
Look at this
I see a
audience.
bunch of familiar faces.
Good group.
See lots of Renko faces in the audience there.
Yes. Oh, this is so fun. I love the new highlighter. This is beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. We've been hard at work for many months.
I'm so excited for this event. Welcome, Kevin. Welcome, Rob. Thank you so much for putting all of this together, guys. Welcome to all the Renko members who are here. And DK will be our moderator tonight, along with Mishti, who will be looking out in the chat for everyone's great questions. And I want to turn it over to Rob very quickly to give an intro to Kevin.
Yeah, I'm excited to intro Kevin, and we'll keep it super brief. I'm Rob Taves. I'm a VC at Highland. I'm a huge fan of Jen and everything that she does, and I'm always happy to plug in and be helpful, and especially with Renko related stuff. But most importantly, I'm also an old college buddy of Kevin's and a former roommate. And so excited to hear Kevin share his wisdom with everyone. In terms of a super brief intro, I think most people are probably familiar with Kevin's background, so I won't do the full bio. Stanford, McKinsey, early at DoorDash. The one really quick thing I thought I'd share that Jen suggested is just kind of some thoughts and memories from when Kevin first started at DoorDash, because we were rooming together in San Francisco at the time. And I remember when he left McKinsey to go to DoorDash, I remember honestly thinking to myself, like, why is Kevin going to this company? He was employee number 9 at the time. Our apartment, as Kevin I'm sure remembers, we're big Grubhub guys. So we're like, Grubhub already exists, man. Like, why does the world need another food delivery service?
We always order a good sandwich on the weekends, you know?
Yeah, that's right, yeah. And so, yeah, ironic that I'm in VC now, given that complete lack of foresight. Obviously, fast forward to today, DoorDash is like a $50 billion company. But I just remember, especially those really early days, it really was like an operating grind. Like Kevin, back then, the notion of a food delivery service was not as socialized as it is today. So like a lot of Kevin's job was going door to door, meeting with restaurants, convincing them to get on the DoorDash platform, and just a lot of that kind of unsexy, unglamorous grind of being an operator and building something of significance. And it was awesome to see it at those early days, and fast forward to today and what an incredible success it's been. So I'm excited to hear Kevin talk about the experience.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the intro, Rob. And thanks, Kevin, for joining us. We're just to kind of remind everybody a little bit about the format for the operators you should know and for all of the sessions we do here. We like to keep it very participatory, so feel free to chime in on the chat over there, ask us questions. We'll read your questions live on air here. We'll invite you up, and we can get to chat with Kevin and learn all about kind of the crazy roller coaster career ride he's been on. So I think part of Rob's intro is actually a nice starting point, because I want to try to get first into your head when you're sitting there, pondering this big career move. You had sort of been in business school, you had gone to McKinsey, you kind of were a professional, a consultant, and what was your connection? How did you first meet or connect or start thinking about this DoorDash opportunity?
Yeah, so first of all, super excited to be here. Thank you all for taking the time, and happy to share some of the stories. So for me, and Rob was a great roommate for those of you who are wondering. So, so I was in consulting. I came in as a business analyst and was your approach around 2 years. And so I think I really enjoyed consulting, and I really enjoyed my time. And had kind of done your classic random walk across different industries and different functions. And I always, so actually Tony, he was a former McKinsey, our CEO Tony was a former McKinsey alum as well. And he had just reached out to a few folks. And right around the 2-year mark, I had said, I'll just picked my head up and think about a few different things and interviewed at different companies, wide variety of companies. And ultimately came back to, hey, I'm actually pretty happy in my current role in consulting, and I will probably consider going forward. And then I happened to be in Palo Alto at the time. I was actually staying at I was serving a Silicon Valley company down there. I was staying in the Westin Hotel in Palo Alto. And I then decided, all right, well, this DoorDash company, or actually at that time they were called Palo Alto Delivery. So not as cool a name. And so I said, oh, it's kind of interesting, and it seems like maybe I just chat with this person. So I ended up going and agreeing to chat with Tony. And so I walked across the street. I remember because I had a late time working, and they were also, it operates like a restaurant business, right? DoorDash very much operates like a restaurant. And so they're like, well, can you interview at 11:30? And so, because that's when they closed up shop, and then I also was kind of free at that time. So I remember I was coming back from my business workloads. I was in the Westin Hotel. I went over to Palo Alto. We were in the Stanford Ave in this little house, and there were mattresses on the ground. There were snacks and chocolate milk sprung around, I remember. And I had to step in for the interview, and we had to move away some of the old Stanford mattresses and say, like, hey, would you? And we started our discussion. And actually, my main interview was calling drivers. So I was trying to figure out how to call drivers and doing driver screens as an interview process. And so
you show up in the interview and they say, okay, for the interview, here's a phone, go.
Yeah. Well, I used my own phone, and I actually thought I figured out the process because basically I would call these drivers who had applied to be drivers, dashers on the platform, and no one answered my call. And so because I called them from a 240 number, I'm from Maryland, and so maybe no one answered, and so we did 3 or 4, and then we had someone else call with their phone, and someone picked up. So I thought, oh my gosh, did I fail this interview? And that side, but yeah, we just spent time calling drivers, and then I did deliveries with a few of the folks on that side as kind of the interview process, or the primary interview process with a few folks. So I think for me, as with many folks who have been in maybe in consulting, they always wondered, all right, I love the problem solving aspect and I love kind of the exposure, but I also was curious, like, what if I had to go hit that thing, or what if I had to go hit that number? And so I wasn't necessarily, I was compelled very much by that opportunity, right? In terms of, all right, if you're the owner to go hit that thing, and what happens if the ball, you have to go take that shot. And so that's kind of the main reason why I joined. Kind of understood the vision a little bit, but in a lot of ways, I was just excited to kind of it seemed pretty scrappy, and I knew it'd be a little bit of a test.
Yeah, and when you say hit the number, I think I know what you mean, but I just want to make sure. Is this like a sales quota or a number of merchants to close, or what is the number in this specific instance?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'll give you an example of. So on my first maybe week 2 or 3, I was initially in charge of dasher supply, right, or driver supply. So at that time, we were quite small, so we didn't have a lot of drivers on the road. So basically, if you were to get one more driver on the road or one more dasher on the road, we would be able to get another delivery. And so it really wasn't supply or it wasn't demand that was limiting us; it was supply. And so I was in charge of the driver side, and I remember. Tony asked, like, all right, can you go help the driver supply? So I remember the first 2 days I came back and I looked at the conversion of the funnel. I looked at the conversion of applicants in, and came back and I kind of shared with Tony, like, hey, here's the deck. If we can just improve conversion here, here, and here, like, we'll be able to get more drivers. And I remember he looked at me and he said, like, what are you doing? Go get more drivers on the road. And I said, oh, okay. I started posting on Craigslist. I started walking around college campuses. I started flyering, door hangering for folks I started doing more and more orientations. Then we had to hire people to do more orientations. Then we started renting out ballrooms to do orientations. And so that was what I was felt. And I had my number. So each week I would have to report out on how many drivers did I onboard and what was my goal. And so, and DoorDash is an interesting business that it operates on a, kind of on a weekly rhythm, but in a lot of ways on a daily, hourly basis, right? Mm-hmm. So I think you can always have a metric or a goal. And so I think that's a little bit about what it meant to like hit the number in that way. And I think DoorDash is unique in that it's a very tangible business. And so you can have these numbers that go hit on such a high frequency basis.
Do a lot of the people who have roles in different operational units within DoorDash each have ownership for a different number? Like maybe how many customer service tickets close, or how many new supply dashers get lined up, or how many new merchants get acquired? Like, is it kind of a number focused culture like that?
For sure, right? And I think I do think there's a difference between like a data driven culture and maybe a kind of number, and I don't know if there's a term, right? A number hitting culture and that side.
It feels like an ownership, like you've got something that you're responsible for, right? Not
sure. Like whatever you are, and I think whatever, and it can be a big number, right? It can be, and I think when you're in a ecosystem or what I would call it, a marketplace, the numbers, oftentimes the number you need to go hit might be a number I need in order for me to hit my number, right? And so DoorDash is also a heavily cross-functional business versus maybe you're in other businesses where I make something and I sell it, right? DoorDash, in fact, is actually trying to create an ecosystem for customers, dashers, merchants. And so it's not as like, I make my iPhone and I sell it, right? That is like, that's different than, all right, you need to hit your number and I need to hit my number. And in order that leads up to another number that needs to be hit. And so for sure, there is a cascading set of numbers that every individual is typically aligned to a number or a portfolio of numbers that they want to go hit.
And how does that affect like the kind of working with cross-functional teams? I guess you're coming from, I'm just trying to put myself in your mind back then. You're coming from a consultant, you're producing a PowerPoint, you're giving a recommendation, and now here you are, feet to the fire. You've got this number. The next person over, one of your colleagues, has a number, and you kind of have maybe some interplay or dependency on each other. So are you like building relationships across the org to try to nurture those so that when you need a little bit of trust me credit, you have it with people? And how do you go about that process?
Yeah, no, it's I like to say that like DoorDash from a strategic perspective is not necessarily super complicated, but from an operating perspective is very complicated, right? So to do like from an overall vision of DoorDash, I actually don't think it's super complicated, but to do it millions and millions of times a day, to do it all across the world, and to do it like DoorDash is a very localized business too. And to make all of the ecosystem work together is quite challenging operationally. And so we will have constant like, all right, there's a certain metric that I need to hit, as well as we call constraint. And that constraint might actually be the goal that another person needs to hit. And so as a operator, you are typically working far more with people outside of your team than on your team, right? And as an operator, you likely, typically the best leaders in this scenario will often be the folks who are able to lead without having a massive team necessarily, right? And the folks who are able to indirectly influence and get all the teams in place to go hit their number, right? And so how do you convince all the different groups to also incorporate your number when everybody's running a mile a minute on that side? And so I think for sure, leadership is, yes, leading your team necessarily, but also being able to coordinate across the company and the systems on that side.
Yeah, I mean, that's all really interesting, especially since in Renco we have so many people who have been consultants or are currently consultants and generalists kind of looking for their next move. I'm kind of curious, if you were to go back to those initial days when you were starting, if there's advice you would give yourselves in terms of like what part of your previous worldview / day-to-day ended up being the most useful. And you kind of spoke about which parts you had to adapt and change a lot, but like what were the nuggets of wisdom that like someone at McKinsey or somewhere else could think about really digging deep on that might help them in the startup world? Also, Rob could probably chime in on this too, because I'm sure you have good perspective looking at your portfolio companies and operators there. But yeah, I was just curious, Kevin, from your perspective.
Yeah. So really, I mean, I really only look for two things, right? So one is how are you as a, and look, people are going to need to figure out what they want. So for me, I've never been content driven or functionally driven. And so what I mean by that is, you know, I like to do a little bit of sales. I like to do a little bit of marketing. I like to do a little analytics, but I don't necessarily, I'm not a data scientist, or I'm not a marketer, or I'm not a sales rep, right? And so, and the same way on the content side, for me personally, I've done the driver side. I've ran the overall geographies. I've done the merchant side of the business, right? And so, you know, for me, I love just like general problem, like complex problems, and I love working in small teams, in cross-functional teams. And I think what is neat in a lot of ways is that there are many places you'll find that I think what we used to think is consulting is the only place where you can build a full career on that. And I think what you'll find, or what I learned, is that like companies in general need folks who can get stuff done, right? Like that's actually a unique skill set in itself. And in fact, that might even be a function. At DoorDash, it kind of is a function on that side. And so when you think about what we look for, one, just how are you as a general problem solver? And so that is a lot of parallels to consulting, right? So how can I break down a problem? How can I break down a problem via data? How can I tell stories? How can I structure the problem overall? Some of them are rather ambiguous, some of them are not, right? I think the second component often, which is maybe a little different from consulting, is then how are you as like an operator? So we just you combine these two and you basically typically get a great operator. And we use these terms: bias towards action, love of hitting the numbers. And so what is that? Sometimes you have to figure out what that actually means or what that looks like. But those two components together make a great, in my mind, super successful person at DoorDash. In terms of consulting, and you can have a bias to action as a consultant, right, on that side. But I think in terms of if you're in your career early in consulting, I think still the love of problems, I think, is always going to be so stimulated. And like DoorDash is just a boatload of problems that just need to get solved day in, day out, et cetera. But I think the test around, you always are, like, look, some folks will want to be going more, let's say, corp dev. In a company, you can often go corp dev. You can go business strategy. You can go operations, right? And all of them are very, very good career paths and also very helpful, right? And or necessary for the company. But I think it's very different how you approach that problem. For a corp dev, maybe I'm thinking much more, maybe I'm doing more of the macroeconomic, right? I'm looking at the overall trends on that side. Mm-hmm. Versus maybe the ops person, I kind of would, in consulting, I would do the macro, wanting to go to the micro very quickly. Yeah. And so I would do the macro because you had to set the stage and the context. But then I was very much more interested or concerned with well, how do I go move that piece that I see open? And I think some folks might actually want to see how are the overall macro trends going, and maybe that's more of a corp dev role, or maybe it's more of an M&A role on something like that. And so I think you just need to find what you're passionate about.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Rob, do you want to jump in on any of that?
Yeah, I have a follow-up question for Kevin on that, pulling from some of the questions on the side that I think are great. I'm curious. The question is how you thought about kind of how you scaled yourself and how you learned to grow as the company grows. If you kind of think from joining as employee number 9, it's very much a scrappy startup, to today, you're managing a team of 350 people. You're a senior leader at the company. That's obviously a tremendous transition that you went through as the company scaled in an incredible way. What advice would you have for other operators who are thinking about how they can kind of train themselves to scale?
Yeah, for sure. I know that Jen mentioned this is being recorded, but so I'll go out on a limb and say this. one of the main reasons why I joined DoorDash too was that I was told I could wear basketball shorts and a t-shirt when I came to work. So like I was pumped to like, what, I don't have to wear a tie, right? I can, I don't have, so there was a lot of scaling and maturing for sure for me, right? Maybe still is, right, on that side. So there were definitely a couple of critical milestones that I hit each time where I felt actually, I need to change how I work. And so when I first joined, which I kind of mentioned, one big learning experience for me was like, what does operating look like? And that was kind of that supply story I just mentioned was a pivotal moment for me in terms of, this is what doing means. Like this is executing. In DoorDash world, this is what executing means. A second thing was when I went down to Los Angeles, where I launched our first market outside of kind of the Bay Area. And I think for me, had to grow. So typically companies will have, you have HQ and then you have a remote office. And so we were a small team. And that was when I first started to build a smaller team in LA. So we had a 3 or 4 person team in LA. And I found that I loved it, right? I just completely loved it. We were a small team in LA. We were doing our thing. We were growing our market. We were, it was kind of almost, and you oftentimes get this like local, DoorDash has its overall culture, but then every single office and city, and because it's a local business, it starts to develop its own culture as well. And I think it was unique to be able to build our office culture, which happened to be in Venice, and we had a cool office that were working together. Then I was asked to move to Chicago, and then ultimately to Boston, and then I ultimately ran the markets. So at that time we had 50, let's call it 30 to 40 cities, depending on how you cut it. And I think there was a big learning experience for me there when Tony one time said, and he still says this, like, Kevin, be a better communicator. So he said, like, be a better communicator, right? And I remember always saying like, so I transitioned from consulting actually to DoorDash. I was a very fast communicator, both in terms of written and verbal. And he often said, your written communication will go far longer or far further than your verbal as you scale from, let's say, a team of 4, where I was able to turn my chair around and like inspire Rob to go do what I need Rob to go do, right? Inspire the team, build the culture, get the excitement. Then when you're multiple, and all of us were on the same page then. At that time, we all knew we wanted to go do, we could finish our sentences. We were aligned on the strategy. Then we were in Chicago or Boston or DC, New York. You couldn't just swivel the chair over. You couldn't just inspire someone via just like energy level and team culture. There needed to be like structure. There needed to be clear goals. There needed to be a clear communication. How do we onboard and train folks? And so for me, that was like just the next one. I'm like, okay, I'm going from a team of maybe 4 or 5 to a team of, let's call it 30 at the time. And then when we started to really ramp across, so that was one where I was like, okay, I need to invest much more in my written and verbal communication. So I remember paying far more attention to how we documented things, how I wrote things, how I communicated things. And then when especially that became more important, when it became, let's say, my first stint at DoorDash, we were probably around 100 folks across, maybe 70, 80 folks across all the cities. And I think that was also a big learning experience for me in terms of communication and on that side. The parts around other things you learn around scaling is people is just everything, right? So you could argue the market conditions. You could say, okay, New York is really tough, or Chicago is really tough versus Atlanta is more open, or this city or that city. But oftentimes the success of our markets were much more correlated with the success and cohesion of our teams. And so, and it's really cool because you had these 3 or 4 person teams that were running these markets, and they're quite diverse. They all have their different, but the teams that were most cohesive, the teams that had a great operating mentality, executed the strategy well, those were the teams that also you just saw in the market as well. And so that's where we kind of built a decent hiring machine. I would say one of the ways DoorDash scaled very well is we became good at identifying talent and then grooming and developing that talent. And I think being dropped in to go, there also was a certain type of individual that was willing to kind of go to Washington, D.C., and no one knows DoorDash and try to like build that thing. And so I think the other big thing is, and it's people, right? And so how do you both attract, retain, develop people is primarily what I focus on today as well. Putting people in the right place to be successful, blocking. So that's a little bit about, I'd say for me now, my stint is a little bit, the diversity of skill sets that I'm hiring against is just continuing to expand. And so traditionally I was hiring a lot of kind of operators, maybe many who are on this call. Then you start hiring, how do I evaluate marketing folks? How do I evaluate sales systems and engineering folks? And what do I offer them, right? I'm never going to be as good at marketing as this person. So what can I bring to the table, and why would they want to be a part of my team, right, in the first place? Or what can I help them unblock, and how can I help them grow? So it ultimately comes probably back to people in terms of scaling.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sarah had a parallel question around scaling, but also kind of how your roles transitioned within DoorDash. Do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit about, coming in as employee number 9. I imagine you were an individual contributor at the start. I guess, what sort of signals did one need to have to start to lead teams and manage? And I'd love to hear kind of what you were just touching on in terms of the balance between hiring generalists and then looking for people with specializations and knowing that they'd add value to your team.
Yeah, I'd say so your last question, I think if the classic, I don't know, maybe there's some startup book that I just like, you typically start generalist, and then as you scale, you go expertise, right? And then you oftentimes, there are worlds where you're 0 to 1, and then there are worlds that are 1 to 10. Maybe there's worlds that are 10 to 10,000, etc. Typically, in your 0 to 1s, you're often always going to want maybe a lean more core generalist. And then as you scale, you might need more expertise. You might need more knowledge in certain categories. We also have this term slope versus y-axis. So we hire on slope, right? Versus and look, Tony is a first-time CEO as well, right? And so, but in a lot of ways, how do we take a chance, right? How do we take a chance on an individual, and we're willing to take a chance, right? And so one of the things I think is very neat about DoorDash is no matter your level of experience, right? I think if you are a good first principles problem solver and you're able to make impact, like, we'll just give you more opportunity. We'll give you more things to drive. We'll give you more metrics to move on that sense. Your first question, so that was kind of answer the question like expertise versus your first question was more around like, how do you think about people management?
Well, I was kind of curious as to like how you approached, after driving impact as an IC. I'm sure leadership entrusted you with more and more responsibility, and then eventually you ended up managing a team and growing through the company. So I'm curious, like, how did you set yourself up for success in moving from like being a high-powered individual contributor to then leading a team?
Yeah. And again, I think this is also going to be distinct to DoorDash. Like, I certainly hope, and I do think most of the strong operators at DoorDash and leaders at DoorDash, many of them are, almost all of them were high-powered ICs. Now, you can be a high-powered IC as a manager as well, right? And now you will need to flex different ways, but that's just one thing I would call out. I definitely never joined DoorDash like with the intention of I want to lead teams, right? That was not necessarily on the table, and that was not really discussed. And from the amount of people that were there, it didn't seem like there weren't a lot of people to manage anyways, right? So I think from my personal experience, it came with focusing on the outputs, um, focusing on the outputs and like trying to move, like maybe relentlessly trying to move my number, and then getting the chance to take on a more complicated number. And so a lot of ways I like to promise folks who are considering DoorDash, it's like, hey, like things change all the time, right? If you hit your number, we're likely going to find other ways for you to hit the number. And if you can hit more numbers and you need more resources, we're going to go make that happen. And so I think that's how it kind of maybe gained momentum in that way. That being said, right, at the same time, really strong ICs don't necessarily make great managers and great people leaders as well. And I think most folks on this call probably know that. I think my encouragement would be to like really question what you want to do, right? Like folks view managing people as or can view managing people as a like goal in a career, right? And I think it's important that actually, in my mind, I would view a capability, like being able to hit a certain number, in my mind, is much more of a career goal or an impact goal, and likely the resources you need to go do that might continue to grow, right? So I don't know, maybe the resources for me to go do X, now I need to be able to recruit and lead marketing folks or product folks or et cetera. But the end goal is never for me, or like the leading goal is not, I want to be able to recruit marketing folks, right? And have a bigger team, right, on that side. And so I think focusing really on at least on some of the outputs, likely in high growth places can come with the opportunity to lead and manage people. And then for me, I kind of mentioned this earlier, I am less inspired by the function, the content, and more inspired far more by either the complexity of the problem, and maybe more so than the complexity of the problem, the people you get to work with, right? And so I feed off the energy of getting to whiteboard with, whether I'm managing that person or not managing that person, I feed off of the energy of getting to be in a team whiteboarding on a tough problem. And I love also being able to enable and empower folks to be able to do that as well. And so that might be, eventually everybody will start to develop their own like leadership and management style as well. But that's kind of how I thought about my initial journey to when I got the first team. And then you start to realize what your leadership strengths are and what your deficiencies are as you go maybe from a small team to a diverse set of teams to a team that is, the big one for me was remote, which is, how do I build team culture when I have remote team members who may never have met me, right? And may never meet me for the next 6 months, right? And I definitely made mistakes along the way. I'll always remember this one time when I kind of took over Chicago and Boston. And I remember I had a vision in my mind of what I wanted to go do, but I hadn't, for both Chicago and Boston, I was coming in from LA. And so a Chicago team, I remember thinking, well, I'm going to be there pretty soon, so I'll just go and meet them first. And the Boston team, I was like, well, I'm not going to be there for a few months, so I'm just going to go try like talking about the solutions right now. And my success in Chicago was much higher because they trusted me. We worked together. Versus Boston, they're like, who is this guy who's from LA trying to go solve Boston problems, right, on that side. So
I wonder actually, when you talk about,
you obviously returned to DoorDash, and that begets a lot of questions itself. I'm curious as to what you learned in your time at Slack that you've applied to your new role at DoorDash, and in particular, when you think of why you chose to return, did you have any concerns about how the culture would have shifted, if at all, in that time away? The reason I ask that is, having seen fast growing startup scale, even a year or two away can mean you're in a completely different world. So if you wouldn't mind just maybe speaking a little bit towards that experience for you in general, both leaving DoorDash for Slack, how that experience was, and then coming back, and just, what your grand takeaway thoughts are on that are in general. For
sure. Lot to unpack there. So if I don't answer all your questions, please just say, hey, Kevin, what about this question? So I was at DoorDash for the first stint for about 2.5 years. And then I ended up going back to Maryland actually for some family stuff. So I then took a little bit of a leave of absence. I went back to Maryland. As I came back to the Bay Area, I kind of was like, hey, should I try something new? Right. And so ultimately was like, hey, I'm going to try something new. Right. I'm relatively early in terms of experiences. And so I've only worked at a couple of companies. Right. So should I try something new? Joined Slack, was in corp dev. So a little bit different role than the role I was in at DoorDash. Obviously, Slack is an amazing company, and loved it. I think for me, the things that I learned a little bit were, for me personally, I want to get back into the consumer world. So you see consumer and enterprise are very different, and I think likely there are a lot of consultants here. And I was not as attuned to this, right? Obviously, you look at role, you look at company, you look at culture, you look at compensation, etc. For me, the cut of enterprise versus consumer is a very big cut. And so, a nuance I had not really been familiar with before. And so, in enterprise software, it's going to be different lead times, different sales cycles, different even organizational setups, right? Different rhythms of the business, right? And in the consumer world, and look, these are on the whole, right? So, but right, enterprise, you have the high margin small customer typically, right? Consumer businesses, you have like large scale, like huge numbers, potentially lower margin, right, on that side. Higher velocity, higher scale, higher test and learn and innovate, right? Like you innovate on millions versus hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands, et cetera, right? And so I miss that ability to just like test and learn fast on something, or go hack something together, around your head in 5-year planning, right? In fact, you're asking the folks, hey, what would be your number, right? And so, or M&A, you may not have a number on your head as much. And so I was used to almost having to keep the lights on, right, for the business. And so I missed a little bit of that. And so ultimately, obviously, have been back at DoorDash for about 2.5 years. And I think quite transparently, I probably underestimated the overall opportunity for DoorDash, right? Both in our existing spaces as well as our adjacent spaces, and maybe I underappreciated the relative autonomy that an individual has to go hit their number, right? And so whether because we're moving too fast, or whether it's just the nature of how we work, you are both given, maybe even asked upon to be, demanded to be highly autonomous. And I really enjoyed that portion and appreciate that portion today, and one of the things I like most about it. And so that's kind of how I think about it.
Thank you. I appreciate the candor. That's really good to get some perspective on those career moves.
For sure.
Cool. And it sounds like some of the transitions around Slack would have been a lot of maybe centralized decision making, because it's kind of a global software platform that operates out of one thing, and DoorDash has maybe a more decentralized nature. Like as you're launching these cities, you're able to make decisions about what are the nuanced pieces of LA's market that you want to address specifically. So I wonder, are there, when an organizations operating in a more decentralized way, like I would imagine the DoorDash experience would be, is that a very explicit decision about how much to centralize and how much to decentralize, or does it kind of like organically grow up that way? And how do you think about that?
Yeah, the decentralized centralized model for many companies is a very I feel like a very hot topic, right? Or can be also very polarizing topic for I feel like it's almost a false trade-off. And so what I mean by that, I think you can be a centralized run group that can operate at a local level, right? And so oftentimes there's this central versus local, right? On that, or decentral, right? On that side, I think you're going to have massive gains in economies of scale and knowledge sharing and skill expertise and career development growth for individuals, right? In a central model, right? You're going to have local expertise, ability to move fast, ability to test and learn and innovate in this local world. But why can't a central person be singularly focused on, in this central group, be singularly focused on Los Angeles and be able to then pull the levers to go help Los Angeles, as an example, right? I mean, this is just a random example. And so I think, and it's hard. It is hard, right? It is hard to execute all these things, but I do think being able to be both almost is what I hope we can be.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to transition up. We invited Jason up. I think Jason had a couple questions in the chat, and I want to bring him up and turn it over because I'm not sure which of the ones are most relevant right now, but Jason, have at it.
Cool. Thanks, David. Thanks, Rob and Kevin, for doing this. Appreciate it. I've actually been in an early stage startup, actually in a delivery business, early days as well. So your stories of being on the phone, calling drivers, recruiting them, and doing crazy in-person meetups to get them on the road was really resonated. But one of the questions I have for you, and I like to ask builders this question a lot, is do you have an elegant framework or way of determining at what point you move away from that kind of manual, unscalable work where you're text messaging drivers and so forth, towards investing in the scalable systems, processes, and solutions? I'd be curious to have your perspective on that.
Yeah, definitely always a challenge. I think in order to scale, I don't know, one, I think you typically hire folks who are better than the role, especially as an early, you hire folks who can do the job, who are willing to do the job today, but can tell you what the job is tomorrow. And so what I mean by that, yes, I was onboarding all day, every day, but I also was working with, and all I was doing was onboarding the whole day, but then I was working with the team to figure out, well, how do we actually scale the onboarding, right? Scale this process, right? And change this. If I was just singly only onboarding the whole time, we would never have scaled, right, on that side. And so, yes, maybe in a lot of ways, and many of our maybe newer employees will often say, oh, I need someone to do this job.
Kevin, you still there? Maybe running a little internet connection. Jason, you got a good joke?
I wish, guys. I got to really brush up on my dad jokes, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
You're a dad now. You can have some dad jokes.
I know, right? I'm embarrassed to say I haven't learned any.
Anybody else? OC? Angela, you got any dad jokes?
It looks like his internet's a bit unstable. It was a good point, though. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people think about this. Hire people that are better than the job they're currently doing. I was going to ask him how he assesses that, though.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm curious about. Also, in the role is kind of unknown, right? These jobs didn't exist before. So how do the people that are being hired even know what the job is going to be, right? So.
Yeah. DK, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the idea of hiring for a specific skill set in a business like basically anything in technology that is quickly changing seems a little bit like, a tough
Fool's errand.
Yeah, fool's errand almost. I mean, I hate to be so harsh about it, but the main feature function you want is people who are adaptable and who are going to figure it out, because necessarily anything you're doing has never been done before. So you need to figure out, like, is this person not good at function X, but are they good at figuring out how to do function X and X prime and X double prime? And so it's really understand. I mean, like Kevin was saying, and here he is back. But like Kevin was saying, it's more about kind of the slope versus the y-intercept. And you really want to, understand how adaptable somebody is. I think you can suss that out through like understanding creative problem solving and understanding like just like a growth mindset, and how is somebody thinking about the world? How do they represent their skills and talents to you or to the world? And do they represent as functional expert, but not so flexible, or do they, just spread wings and total flexibility and figure it out and hungry and aggressive like that? So, but lots of different ways to look at it. But that's the one pattern that I feel like I've seen a lot and seems to work well when we see it. Welcome back, Kevin.
Apologies. Can you? And one way to scale is you get good internet. So yeah, I apologize for that.
No problem at all.
We started getting DK's perspective on the topic, but back to you.
Yeah, we're looking for dad jokes in case you have any.
I definitely don't have that, but the one thing I would say that is how do we kind of have this value of like 1% better every day, and so the scaling of it, if it just slightly like gets more and more scalable each time, like ideally, in fact, the amount of unscalable things you're doing in my mind is not decreasing, but it's just like the unscalable things you're doing is just changing, right? Like the content or the purpose of it, right? Because you almost just keep building your foundation of things, and then you keep on if you're stopped doing unscalable things, you're not really innovating necessarily, right? And so but if you're continuing to quote unquote innovate on the same problem each time, then maybe you're not advancing. And so that's kind of how I would measure. Like, are you kind of saying, just so I'm understanding you correctly, that the amount of time percentage wise that you spend out of your day on non-scalable versus scalable kind of is persistent over time? Yeah, for like, and it will come in chunks, right? It comes in chunks, but I certainly, so for me, it's often, I think at core, more 0 to 1. But to do some things, you got to do, for 1 to 10, you got to do a different thing, like scalable things, right, on that side. But I think you can also, depending on the company, right, you can be able to find your place where you can always flex that 0 to 1 muscle and that unscalable stuff. And so even though you're running of the business, like we hopefully don't hire folks to just run the business, right? We hire folks to be able to like improve and optimize the business. And so, maybe you're doing this, 60, 70% of like, all right, here's what I'm running, but then you choose your 1 or 2 bets that are what's your unscalable thing you're going to test to then scale it next quarter. What like we often, whether we test it in one market, whether we test it with one team, right? Whether we test it, what you test is going to be definitely unscalable. And then, but since it's so costly typically to scale from a product engineering perspective, we'll often want a proof of concept in the beginning to then, all right, let's productize this. Right on. And David, can I ask one quick follow-up? Because since Kevin mentioned the 1% better, because I've always been curious, having followed the space for a while, DoorDash has beat out Grubhub and some of the early incumbents, right, in a space where it was a late entrant. And I'm curious, what do you think has enabled DoorDash to be so successful? Is it the culture, some of this 1% better, or is it the people? Because you guys are dominating in terms of market share now. Yeah, well, I'd say we still have a long ways to go, and who knows, right? This space can change all the time, right? And so I think my answer would far more be like, who knows? But I would say people, right? I believe people are like in talent, and talent development is the competitive advantage in whatever industry you're in, or whatever company you're in on that side. And so for sure you'll have, a big war chest for some like a resourcing perspective, or the best, first mover advantage on strategy side, et cetera, right? But I do think long term, I think people and you support and allows people to grow and operate and build is got to be one of the biggest competitive advantages.
Great. Thanks so much, guys.
Great. All right. Well, I know
that the last, there was a lot, you made me think, a lot of times we walking around and say, oh, you work for DoorDash, I guess, which is a jeans or something, the DoorDash, right? You're this. One thing that working at DoorDash did teach me, and I think is very important for anybody who joins companies in general, and even any career actually, is like one of the maybe the most underestimated qualities of an employee is like kind of blind, like deep optimism. And so I am actually a very pessimistic in terms of like, oh, we're not gonna hit this number, we're not. But like maybe inherently, and I would say Tony, for example, is to be in a business where you basically got angry customers, angry dashers, angry merchants every single day, right? And you look at all these broken things and et cetera, like you gotta be an optimist to like keep going, right, on that side. And so when basically everybody thinks your company is a gene company, right, or has no idea, right? It teaches you the humility factor when you go door to door, and it's like no, right, no, but you kind of are optimistic, right, or you are maybe sometimes unreasonably optimistic, and so I think for me it was actually more probably born from the people I got to work with versus like, look, that's why I also think whether DoorDash made it or makes it or made it or not, like I think it was fun to work with the group. And so I think you can never underestimate just the team you get to work with and build together. That makes it quite fun. And then you feed off that energy, and then you have an optimism about it. And then also I think it's helpful to be inherently a little bit optimistic long term, because you're never going to face so many things that would almost tell you to turn back, right, on that side.
Cool. Well, thanks. I just want to note that we're getting near the end of the hour, and that we sort of decided to spend together. And so I do want to be sensitive to everybody's time and schedule. But before we leave, we actually have a few announcements that we're going to let Jen make, and then we have one final question that we like to ask guests. So we'll chime in with that after Jen provides a few housekeeping announcements.
All right. Thank you so much, Kevin. And thank you, Rob, for inviting Kevin and DK and Mishti. This was wonderful. Really appreciated the conversation tonight. I just want to say, if you enjoyed the show tonight, or if you didn't, and you have ways for us to improve, we would love to hear it. So please fill out your feedback form, which you'll get in your inbox tomorrow morning from me. We really appreciate it, and we really value the feedback. All right, DK, your one last
Great.
question.
All right, so we've sort of, had you here, and we've had the chance to ask you questions all evening, and we've gotten a lot of interesting insight on your career and as an operator and kind of the patterns. We also like to turn the tables at this point and hear from you what's kind of the one question that you have for us or for the world at large. And so what is something that you're curious about, or what's top of mind? And it could be deep and philosophical, it could be flippant, it could be whatever's top of mind right now. So no pressure at all, but it's just something fun that we like to do. And we can follow up on Twitter and chat with you about it and chime in with ideas there.
Have you guys ordered yet? No, I'm just kidding.
how Renko can help you too, like how our community can be most helpful.
Yeah, I think, well, going back a little bit to the theme around talent, right? And kind of adding to the DoorDash family, I think always, very tactically, always like, it's always, it's unique to find people who are great problem solvers, great energy, great teammates, and kind of hungry. And I think that is always an appreciated, if you yourself or you know someone who is interested, I think that's always going to go a long way on that side. And so that's probably number one. And then maybe number two is what I didn't talk a little bit about, what I didn't talk a lot about today was DoorDash is in the business of, like, particularly in this challenging time period, but always kind of long term and for forever, right? How do we help local businesses, local economies, local commerce in general? And so, whether that is through DoorDash or through some other way, right? I think my more longer term or a less tactical ask would be to encourage you all to figure out how to support the restaurant community and the local commerce community is what I'd say.
Great. And I know DoorDash has a lot of initiatives around that itself, and so you're getting to do some of that today. And I think there's stuff that we can do in the future too. So we'll send up some links around that as a follow-up. And once again, thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. We really appreciate all of your thinking and wisdom on your career.
Awesome. Thanks all. Right. Feel free to reach out, Kevin at DoorDash, and have a great rest of the week.
Thanks, Kevin. Have a good one.
Kevin. All right. Bye.